The life they imagined. In the affluent suburbs of Boston, where manicured lawns stretched out before grand colonial homes, the Wilson family seemed to have it all. Margaret and James Wilson were the epitome of success and sophistication. Their lives were an intricate dance of social events, high-end fashion, and prestigious memberships at the country club. Their home was an architectural masterpiece, complete with marble floors, antique furniture, and rooms filled with rare art. James, a successful real estate mogul, spent his days negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, while Margaret, the perfect socialite, organized charity galas and rubbed elbows with the city's elite. Everything about their life was meticulously planned, from the expensive vacations to the designer wardrobes. They were revered in Boston society, known for their impeccable taste and seemingly perfect marriage. Yet, despite their outward success, there was something missing in their lives: a child to complete their picture-perfect family. When Margaret discovered she was pregnant at the age of 40, it felt like the final touch to their already enviable life. The news was met with celebration among their circle, as Margaret was a woman who could seemingly do no wrong. She immediately began planning for the arrival of their child with the same precision she applied to every other aspect of her life. The couple converted their guest wing into an elaborate nursery, with hand-picked furniture and a designer baby room that could rival any luxury hotel suite. James even commissioned a renowned artist to create murals for the baby's room, an idyllic landscape that would be the backdrop of their future family life. Margaret couldn't contain her excitement. "She'll be perfect," she often told her friends during their weekly tennis matches. "With James's bone structure in my eyes, how could she not be?" The baby shower, hosted at their sprawling estate, was the talk of Boston society. The gifts piled high, and among them were fine china from Tiffany, designer baby clothes from Hermes, and a crib made of polished oak from a local artisan. It was a display of wealth and taste, an outward representation of the future they envisioned for their child. As the months passed, Margaret and James's excitement grew. Their lives, already filled with luxury and privilege, would soon be graced with the laughter and joy of a child. They imagined their daughter playing tennis at the country club, hosting tea parties in the garden, and growing up to be as poised and polished as they were. They believed this child would be the ultimate addition to their already perfect existence. But fate, as it often does, had different plans. The day Charlotte was born, a crisp September morning in 1985, the usual celebrations of a newborn's arrival were replaced by uneasy silence. The delivery room, which should have been filled with the joyous sounds of new life, was instead filled with the hushed whispers of medical staff. Margaret and James looked at each other, their faces pale, as the nurse gently placed their newborn daughter in Margaret's arms. The baby, a girl, had severe craniofacial abnormalities. Her features were asymmetrical, her nose flattened on one side, and her upper lip split in a bilateral cleft. The sight of her, so far from the idealized child they had imagined, struck Margaret like a blow to the chest. She recoiled instinctively, turning her head away. The nurse, unsure of how to comfort the new mother, tried to place Charlotte in her arms again, but Margaret refused, her eyes filled with a mix of shock and disbelief. James, meanwhile, paced back and forth in the corridor. His perfectly manicured hands trembled as he made desperate phone calls to plastic surgeons across the country, trying to find a solution, a way to fix the imperfections he saw in his daughter. But no one could promise the miracle he was searching for. His voice, usually so commanding and sure, cracked as he begged for help. Hours turned into days, and yet the situation remained unchanged. When Charlotte was just 3 days old, Sister Mary Catherine, a nun from St. Agnes Orphanage, found a basket on the doorstep of the hospital. Wrapped in a soft, monogrammed Burberry blanket, Charlotte lay inside, her small face partially visible, but still unmistakable in her features. A note was tucked inside the blanket, its elegant script barely legible. "We cannot give her the life she deserves. Please find her a better family." Sister Mary Catherine held the baby carefully, her heart heavy with the weight of the message. As she looked down at Charlotte, she noticed something that others would overlook. The baby's eyes, despite the facial deformities, held a remarkable spark of intelligence and determination. There was something special about her, something that defied the physical imperfections. "God doesn't make mistakes," the nun whispered, gently cradling the baby. "Let's find out what special purpose He has for you." It was the beginning of Charlotte's journey, one that would be filled with challenges, but also with a power that no one could yet understand. Charlotte was more than her appearance. She had a purpose that would transcend the shallow expectations of beauty and redefine the true meaning of worth. Though the Wilsons were oblivious to the presence of their daughter at the orphanage, the small, fragile baby had already begun to take root in the hearts of those who saw her for who she truly was. The journey of Charlotte Grace was about to unfold in a way that no one, not even Sister Mary Catherine, could have predicted. A new beginning. Charlotte's first days at St. Agnes Orphanage were filled with the quiet hum of routine, yet there was an undeniable tension that surrounded her arrival. Sister Mary Catherine, the head of the orphanage, took Charlotte in her arms and immediately felt the gravity of the situation. She had seen many children come and go, each with their own stories, each with their own needs, but there was something about Charlotte that tugged at her heart in a way that no child had before. Though Charlotte's physical appearance might have caused others to look away in discomfort, Sister Mary Catherine saw something different in the baby. The child's large, dark eyes were full of a quiet intelligence, a spark that made the nun believe that there was something extraordinary about this little girl, something far beyond what could be seen on the surface. As the days turned into weeks, and then months, Charlotte continued to grow, and so did the awareness of her exceptional nature. The orphanage was a place of refuge for many children, but it was also a place of emotional scars and forgotten dreams. It was often quiet in the long halls of St. Agnes, save for the occasional laughter of children at play or the soft murmur of the nuns praying in the chapel. Charlotte, however, never seemed to conform to the expectations of the other children. While the others were content to play or wander about aimlessly, Charlotte was different. She was already captivated by something far deeper than toys or games: the sound of music. It wasn't long before Sister Mary Catherine noticed the baby girl's fascination with sound. During the daily morning mass, while the other children fidgeted in their pews, Charlotte sat quietly, her eyes wide, absorbed in the hymns sung by the choir. The music seemed to speak to her in ways that nothing else did. After mass one day, Sister Mary Catherine found Charlotte alone in the old music room, her tiny fingers pressing against the worn keys of the piano, mimicking the melody she had just heard. The sound was nothing short of miraculous. A 4-year-old child, with no formal training, was playing a complex arrangement of music that far surpassed the capabilities of someone her age. "Child, who taught you to play?" Sister Mary Catherine asked, her voice a mix of astonishment and awe. Charlotte turned her head toward the nun, her lips pulling into a serene smile, though her face was still marked by the features that had made her so difficult for others to accept. "The angels," she said simply, as though the answer was as natural as breathing. Sister Mary Catherine smiled, her heart warmed by the simple but profound words. She could see now that Charlotte's gift was more than just a talent for playing an instrument. It was a connection to something larger, something divine. The music seemed to flow through her in a way that was beyond comprehension, and it was clear to the nun that Charlotte's journey was one that would change the lives of everyone who crossed her path. From that moment on, Sister Mary Catherine became determined to nurture Charlotte's gift, believing that this child was destined for something great. But the outside world was not ready for Charlotte's brilliance, nor was it ready to look past her appearance. While she found solace and acceptance within the walls of St. Agnes, the outside world was less kind. The few visitors who came to the orphanage would stare and whisper behind their hands when they saw Charlotte, their discomfort so palpable that it could almost be felt in the air. Some would pull their children away when they saw her, shielding them from the perceived imperfection. Others would look at her with pity, unsure of what to make of the little girl with such a unique face. But Charlotte, blissfully unaware of the judgments that others passed, thrived. She became the unofficial music teacher of Street Agnes, helping the younger children learn their first notes, teaching them the importance of rhythm, and conducting the orphanage's modest corps. By the time she was 12, Charlotte's musical abilities had far surpassed those of anyone around her. Her gift for playing the piano, for understanding music on a deeper level, was undeniable. Yet, despite her rising talent, public performances remained a distant dream. Charlotte was reluctant to perform in front of anyone outside of the orphanage, knowing that her face would always draw unwanted attention. But all that changed when a woman named Eleanor Brighton walked into Street Agnes. Eleanor was a renowned vocal coach from the Boston Conservatory, known for her sharp eye for talent. She had come to donate some old music books to the orphanage, but what she heard when she walked into the music room stopped her in her tracks. The sound of a piano being played effortlessly, beautifully, with an emotional depth that surpassed anything Eleanor had ever heard from a child, drew her in. The piece being played was Bach's Prelude in C major, an intricate, challenging piece that even many professional musicians struggle to master. "That's not possible," Eleanor whispered, a look of disbelief on her face. The arrangement was more advanced than anything she had expected from a child, let alone one so young. The music seemed to float in the air, light and graceful, yet full of soul and longing. Eleanor followed the sound, eventually finding Charlotte sitting alone at the piano, lost in the music. The young girl's fingers moved over the keys with the kind of grace and precision that made Eleanor's breath catch. She had seen many pianists over her long career, but none like this. When Charlotte finished, she looked up, startled to see the woman standing in the doorway. Her instinct was to lower her head and hide her face, as she had done for years whenever anyone looked at her with anything less than kindness. But this time, Eleanor didn't look away. She didn't recoil in discomfort or pity. Instead, she looked at Charlotte's hands, those graceful, sure hands that told a story of talent, of strength, of resilience. "Look at me, dear," Eleanor said gently, taking a step forward. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, her long dark hair falling in front of her face as she tried to hide her imperfections. But Eleanor's voice was soft, inviting, and full of warmth, and slowly, Charlotte raised her head. The two locked eyes, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Eleanor didn't see the scars or the disfigurement. She saw the musician. She saw the artist. She saw the beauty that radiated from Charlotte's hands, from her soul. "You've never had formal training, have you?" Eleanor asked, her voice filled with admiration. "No, ma'am," Charlotte replied softly. "I just hear the music in my head." Eleanor smiled, sitting down next to Charlotte on the piano bench. She had taught at the conservatory for over 30 years, but she had never heard anyone play like this before, especially not someone so young, so untrained. Charlotte's music was raw, unrefined, but it was pure, it was real. There was something almost otherworldly about it. "I'll teach you," Eleanor said, her decision firm. "I'll teach you everything I know, and I'll do it for free." Charlotte's heart fluttered in her chest. The idea of having someone teach her, of being guided by someone who believed in her, was almost too much to comprehend. But there was something else that held her back, her face. She had learned to live in the shadows of her own appearance, to hide from the judgment of others. "But my face," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible. Eleanor took Charlotte's hands gently in hers. "When you play, no one will be looking at your face," she said softly. "They'll be too busy watching your hands create magic." And just like that, the door to Charlotte's future swung open. With Eleanor's guidance, Charlotte would find a way to share her music with the world. Her journey, filled with adversity and self-doubt, was only just beginning. But the first step had been taken. She had found someone who believed in her, someone who saw her not for the way she looked, but for the beauty that lived inside her. For the first time in her life, Charlotte felt that perhaps she was more than just her appearance. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was worthy of being seen. The awakening. The months following Charlotte's first meeting with Eleanor were nothing short of transformative. Under the vocal coach's patient and experienced guidance, Charlotte's musical talent blossomed in ways that even she hadn't expected. Eleanor didn't just teach Charlotte how to play piano. She taught her how to see music in its purest form, to embrace every note with her heart and soul, and to pour everything she was into each performance. There was a sense of urgency in Eleanor's teachings, as if she understood that Charlotte had a purpose far greater than what anyone could have imagined. But the journey wasn't without its struggles. Charlotte's growing reputation as a prodigy was both a gift and a curse. Within the walls of Street Agnes, she was loved and admired. She was the star pupil, the teacher's assistant, the leader of the orphanage choir. But when it came to performing in public, she still struggled. Her face, once an object of confusion and shame, remained a barrier that others could not look past. Though Eleanor had promised her that music would shield her from judgment, the reality was that not everyone in the world was as accepting. The outside world, with its unrelenting standards of beauty, was still a place where Charlotte felt like an outsider. Her first public recital, held at a local community hall, was a nerve-wracking experience. Eleanor had spent weeks preparing her, but no amount of practice could quiet Charlotte's fears. The evening before the performance, Charlotte sat alone in the chapel at Street Agnes, her fingers nervously running over the keys of the old piano. "What if they don't like me?" she whispered aloud to herself. "What if they just see my face?" The words echoed in the quiet chapel, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows on the walls. She had been asking herself these questions for years, ever since she had learned to recognize the discomfort in others when they saw her. But now, as she prepared to step onto the stage for the first time, the question had become impossible to ignore. Sister Mary Catherine, sensing Charlotte's inner turmoil, quietly entered the room and sat beside her. Without a word, she placed a hand on Charlotte's shoulder, offering silent comfort. The old nun had seen the girl's inner struggle for years, and she knew how much this performance meant to her. "What if they're cruel?" Charlotte asked softly, looking up at Sister Mary Catherine, her eyes filled with vulnerability. "What if they only see the imperfections?" Sister Mary Catherine looked at Charlotte with the same understanding that had always guided her. "Charlotte," she said gently, "it is not the imperfections they will see if you play with your heart. It is the music. The music will speak for you. You don't have to say anything. Just let the music be your voice." Charlotte remained silent for a moment, absorbing the nun's words. Slowly, she nodded, her fingers once again resting on the keys. As her fingers brushed the piano, a soft melody began to emerge, a song of doubt, of fear, but also of hope. In that moment, Charlotte realized something profound. Her music was the truest part of her. It had no face, no judgment. It was simply her, unfiltered and pure. The day of the recital arrived, and the atmosphere in the hall was one of excitement and anticipation. Charlotte stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest, as she peered through the curtains. The audience was already seated, their faces a blur in the dim light. She could hear the soft murmur of conversation, the clinking of silverware from the cocktail tables where refreshments were being served. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the hem of her dress, a dress she had borrowed from one of the older girls at Street Agnes. She felt small and out of place among the polished, expensive gowns worn by the other performers, but she was determined to step out onto that stage. As her name was called, Charlotte took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. She could hear a few gasps from the audience, a few hushed whispers as people looked her up and down. Their eyes followed her every movement, but Charlotte refused to meet their gaze. She focused on the piano, her sanctuary, where nothing else mattered but the music she was about to create. The audience was expecting a child to perform, and what they got was a young girl who had the soul of an artist beyond her years. As her fingers danced over the keys, the familiar strains of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata filled the hall. The first few notes were tentative, but then they grew in strength and confidence. As Charlotte played, She poured her heart into the music, channeling every ounce of her emotion into each phrase. The music flowed like a river, gentle, but relentless in its beauty. The audience, initially skeptical, was captivated. The room fell silent as Charlotte's performance unfolded. Her movements were graceful, fluid, her fingers caressing the keys with an ease that made it seem as if the piano itself was a part of her. Each note was perfectly placed, each rest a moment of silence that spoke volumes. As the final note of the sonata echoed through the hall, the room was still. For a moment, no one moved. No one dared to break the spell Charlotte had cast. And then, slowly, a single clap broke the silence. One person began to applaud, and then another, until the entire room was on its feet, applauding with all their might. Charlotte blinked, stunned by the overwhelming response. She had expected whispers, stares, perhaps even mockery. But this was different. The music had done its job. It had transcended the judgments, the expectations, and had allowed her to connect with the audience in a way that words could never accomplish. In the front row, Margaret and James Wilson sat frozen, their faces pale. Margaret's hand flew to her throat as she stared at the girl who had just played with such depth and emotion. She recognized the features of the young pianist, but it was the music, the raw, beautiful music, that struck her most. The girl who had been left at the doorstep of street Agnes, the girl she had abandoned, was now a young woman whose talents surpassed anything Margaret had ever imagined. James's grip on the armrest of his chair tightened. His heart raced as he watched Charlotte, now standing and bowing to the audience, a serene expression on her face. This was not the child they had imagined in their dreams. This was something more, something real. As Charlotte stood there, basking in the applause, she felt a mixture of emotions: joy, relief, but also something more profound, a sense of peace. She had just played for a room full of strangers, people who had seen her for the first time, and they had accepted her. The music had bridged the gap between who she was and how she was perceived. It had allowed them to see her for what she truly was, a gifted musician, a young woman with a voice that demanded to be heard. But as Charlotte walked off the stage and returned to her seat, her heart was heavy with a new realization. Her birth parents were sitting just a few rows away. They had seen her, heard her play, but would they recognize her? Would they understand what they had given up when they left her behind? For now, Charlotte knew that it didn't matter. She had found her voice, and it was louder than any whisper of judgment. She had proven to herself that she was more than her face, more than her circumstances. She was a musician, a force to be reckoned with, and no one, not even her birth parents, could take that away from her. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte's reputation began to grow. Eleanor, who had seen her potential from the beginning, took her to new heights, pushing her to take on more complex pieces, to challenge herself in ways she had never imagined. Charlotte's music began to reflect her inner transformation. It was no longer just about playing notes. It was about telling a story, about sharing a part of herself with the world. But even as Charlotte's musical career began to blossom, there was still the question of her past, of the parents who had abandoned her, who had left her in the hands of strangers because they couldn't see beyond her face. Would they ever come back? Would they ever recognize her as the daughter they had left behind? Charlotte didn't know, but she knew one thing for sure. Her music was hers. It belonged to her. And no matter what the future held, she would always have it. Unlikely encounters. The months following Charlotte's performance at the community hall were filled with both anticipation and trepidation. As word of her extraordinary musical ability spread, she began receiving invitations to play at local events, competitions, and small recitals. Each performance felt like another test of her strength, not just as a musician, but as someone who had been rejected before she even had the chance to be known. Her face, always a reminder of her parents' abandonment, still drew stares, yet Charlotte's resolve remained unshaken. Music was her true language, and in it she found a place to express everything she had felt, but could never say. One evening, as Charlotte practiced late into the night at the Boston Conservatory, she overheard voices in the hallway that caught her attention. The names being mentioned were of people she had heard of only in passing, people whose influence had the power to shape the world she was striving to become a part of. "Did you hear? Margaret Wilson is chairing the showcase committee this year," one voice murmured. "She's the one married to James Wilson, the real estate mogul." The name struck Charlotte like a bolt from the blue. Margaret Wilson, her birth mother, the woman who had abandoned her just days after birth. The realization hit Charlotte like a punch to the stomach. She had been trying to forget that part of her past, trying to focus only on the music that had been her salvation. But now, the ghost of her former life seemed to have returned, much more tangible than she had expected. Her fingers froze on the keys as the words repeated in her mind. Margaret Wilson, the same woman who had once declared, "She'll be perfect," now had the power to shape the very recital Charlotte had been preparing for. Eleanor, her teacher, had been working with her for months to prepare Charlotte for the upcoming Boston Conservatory Junior Showcase, a prestigious event featuring young talent from all over New England. Eleanor had pushed Charlotte to the edge of her musical capabilities, preparing her for an audience that would include the finest minds in Boston's arts community. But now, with Margaret Wilson in the spotlight, the upcoming performance was about to become something far more personal than Charlotte could have anticipated. The next day, during one of Charlotte's lessons, Eleanor noticed something was off. Charlotte's hands were shaking, and she couldn't focus. She stumbled through a piece she had previously mastered, and her usual grace was nowhere to be found. "What's troubling you, dear?" Eleanor asked, her voice laced with concern. Charlotte bit her lip and hesitated. She had always trusted Eleanor, but this felt different. How could she explain what was happening inside her, the storm of emotions that had risen within her the moment she had heard her birth mother's name? I found out that my birth mother will be at the showcase," Charlotte whispered. "Margaret Wilson. She's the committee chair." Eleanor's face softened as she sat beside Charlotte on the piano bench. "And how do you feel about that?" Charlotte's fingers trembled, and for the first time in years, her resolve wavered. She had never imagined that her path to success would intersect with the people who had abandoned her so easily. "What would they think of me now?" she wondered. "What if they don't even recognize me?" "I don't know," Charlotte admitted. "I spent my whole life trying to make peace with who I am, trying to find a place where I can just be me. But now she'll be there, watching, and I don't know if I can handle that." Eleanor looked at Charlotte with quiet understanding. She had always known about Charlotte's past, about the abandonment that had defined so much of her early life, but she had never pressed her on it. Now she could see the depth of the conflict inside her. But Eleanor also knew something that Charlotte was still learning, that music had the power to transcend all boundaries, all judgments. "Charlotte," Eleanor said gently, "you don't need their approval. You've already proven everything you need to prove. This is about you and your music. When you play, the world will see you for who you are, not for what they expect you to be, not for who you were in the past, but for the person you've become through the music. You play because the music calls you to, not because anyone else is watching." The words lingered in the air like a promise, and slowly, Charlotte nodded. She couldn't let fear control her anymore. She had come too far to let the shadow of her past hold her back. But the question still lingered, gnawing at her. What if her parents recognized her and felt the weight of their decision? What if they regretted abandoning her? Would that be enough for her to forgive them? The showcase arrived sooner than Charlotte had expected, the days leading up to it filled with a nervous anticipation she had never known. She spent hours practicing each piece, perfecting her technique, but each time her hands touched the keys, she couldn't help but think of the woman who would be watching her, evaluating her from the front row. Would Margaret Wilson remember the child she had abandoned? The girl whose face had not fit into the perfect world she and her husband had created. The night of the showcase, the Boston Conservatory's concert hall was filled with people from all walks of life. Students, parents, patrons of the arts. Everyone had gathered to witness the future of music, to witness young talent. As Charlotte sat backstage, preparing herself for the performance, she heard the murmur of voices and the shuffle of feet as the audience filed in. Margaret Wilson was there, seated near the front, her elegant Channel dress drawing the eyes of everyone in the room. Charlotte felt a deep pit form in her stomach as she spotted her birth mother in the crowd, but she forced herself to focus. The music had to come first. It was the only thing she had complete control over. When her name was announced, Charlotte stood and walked to the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, but the one pair that mattered most was Margaret's. For a fleeting moment, Charlotte wondered if she would be able to play at all, if the fear would overwhelm her. But then something shifted inside her. As she sat at the grand piano and the first notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata filled the room, Charlotte lost herself in the music. It was no longer about impressing the audience, nor was it about proving anything to her birth mother. It was simply her and the piano, two parts of the same whole. The audience, captivated by the richness of her playing, fell silent as she poured everything she had into the piece. But in the third row, Margaret Wilson's face went pale. Her hand flew to her throat as she watched Charlotte, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and recognition. There was no mistaking it now. The girl she had abandoned, the girl whose imperfections had once been too much to bear, was now an artist whose music filled the entire concert hall with an emotion so raw that it was impossible to ignore. The performance ended, and the audience erupted into thunderous applause. Charlotte, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment, stood and curtsied, but her gaze remained fixed on Margaret. Their eyes met across the concert hall, a mother's eyes, filled with a strange mix of pride, regret, and sorrow, locking with her daughter's, who had found her voice through the very thing her parents had dismissed all those years ago. As Charlotte walked off the stage, she knew that her performance had been more than just a success. It had been a moment of reckoning. She had played not just for herself, but for the little girl who had been cast aside, for the woman she had become, and for the woman who had once left her behind. Charlotte had no need for their approval anymore. She had found something far more valuable: her purpose, her music, and herself. But what would Margaret Wilson do now? Would she recognize what she had given up? Would she acknowledge the daughter she had never truly seen? That question hung in the air, unanswered, as Charlotte disappeared backstage, leaving the audience and her past behind her, a heart divided. The days after Charlotte's performance were a blur of interviews, congratulatory messages, and invitations from prestigious music institutions eager to offer her scholarships and opportunities. Yet, amid the excitement and accolades, Charlotte felt a growing sense of unrest. Her birth parents had seen her, really seen her, for the first time in over a decade, but their reactions were still unclear. What would come of this unexpected reunion? Could she ever truly forgive them for abandoning her all those years ago, or would she forever be trapped in the shadow of their rejection? The question lingered in her mind like an unanswered note, its resonance impossible to escape. Sister Mary Catherine, who had been at the concert, had watched the entire event unfold with a quiet satisfaction. She had always believed in Charlotte's potential, and now she was witnessing the very moment of reckoning. Still, she knew that Charlotte's path was far from straightforward. The young woman would have to face her past and reconcile the hurt with the woman she had become. As the days passed after the performance, Sister Mary Catherine could see the toll the situation was taking on Charlotte, who was caught between the success she had achieved and the unresolved emotions swirling around her birth parents. "Charlotte," Sister Mary Catherine said one evening, finding the girl alone in the chapel, her fingers lightly grazing the piano keys, "I know this has been difficult for you, but you've come so far. You have found your voice, and now it's time to decide what to do with it." Charlotte turned to look at the nun, her face still carrying the weight of the performance she had just completed. "I thought I had already made my decision," Charlotte replied quietly. "I thought I could keep moving forward, focusing only on my music, leaving the past behind. But it's not that simple, is it? Sister Mary Catherine smiled gently, her eyes filled with understanding. No, my dear, it's not that simple, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. I've spent my whole life trying to make peace with my face, with who I am, Charlotte continued, her voice shaky. But now I have to deal with them. With the people who left me behind. I don't know how to even begin. The nun sat down beside her on the bench, placing a hand on Charlotte's shoulder. You don't have to do it alone, she said. You have people who care about you, people who have always seen your worth, long before anyone else did. Charlotte let out a long breath, feeling the weight of her words. It was true. There had always been people who believed in her, who saw her for more than her physical appearance. Yet her birth parents still loomed in the background, their faces frozen in her memory, their decision to abandon her still an open wound that she wasn't sure how to heal. That evening, as Charlotte sat by the piano, her fingers moving over the keys absent-mindedly, she found herself lost in thought. Her music, once a source of solace, now felt like a distant echo, like something she could no longer reach. The questions about her parents, about the past, had taken root in her mind, and the melody she was trying to play felt fragmented, incomplete. Charlotte, a voice broke through her thoughts, and she looked up to see Eleanor standing in the doorway. Can we talk? Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. Eleanor had been more than a teacher to her. She had become a mentor, a guide who had believed in her when no one else had. And now, as Charlotte faced the storm of emotions brought on by her birth parents' presence in her life, Eleanor's calm presence was a lifeline. I don't know what to do, Charlotte admitted. I keep thinking about them. What if they want something from me? What if they just want to apologize? But how could I ever forgive them? Eleanor walked over and sat beside her, her presence as steady as the piano beneath their hands. Forgiveness isn't always about absolving someone else of their actions, she said softly. It's about freeing yourself from the weight they put on your shoulders. You don't have to forgive them right away, Charlotte, but you can choose how you move forward. You've already shown the world who you are. Now it's time to show them too. Charlotte looked at her, unsure. But how do I face them? What if I'm not ready? What if I don't want to? Eleanor smiled, her eyes filled with compassion. You don't have to do anything until you're ready. But I believe you're stronger than you realize. And sometimes the hardest thing to do is to give yourself permission to feel, to heal. You don't have to make any grand decisions now. Just take it one step at a time. The next few days passed with Charlotte feeling like she was suspended between two worlds. The world she had built at Street Agnes, surrounded by people who loved and accepted her, and the world of her birth parents, who seemed so far removed from the person she had become. She spent hours practicing at the conservatory, but even the music couldn't drown out the noise in her head. Every time she sat down at the piano, she was confronted with the questions that had haunted her since she was a child. And then one day, she received a letter. The letter was from Margaret Wilson's lawyer, and it carried with it a request, one that Charlotte had never expected. Margaret and James wanted to meet with her. They wanted to explain, to apologize, to make amends for the years they had lost. The letter, written in elegant script, carried an air of formality, but it also spoke of regret. Charlotte held the letter in her hands, feeling a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Her first instinct was to throw it away, to ignore it, to pretend it didn't exist. But deep down, she knew that wasn't possible. The question of whether or not to meet them, to confront them, was no longer something she could ignore. The music had brought her here, but now it was time for her to face the truth of her past. She didn't know if she was ready to forgive them. She didn't know if she ever could. But there was one thing she knew for certain. She wasn't the same girl who had been abandoned all those years ago. She had found her voice through music, through the people who had believed in her when no one else had. And now, it was time to decide what to do with the life she had built. I'll meet them, Charlotte finally said, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. "But on my terms, and when I'm ready." Eleanor, who had been watching from across the room, walked over and placed a gentle hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "But remember, you don't owe them anything. You're doing this for yourself, not for them." Charlotte nodded, her resolve hardening. She had already proven to the world, and to herself, that she was more than the face they had abandoned. Now it was time for her birth parents to see the woman she had become, and for Charlotte to finally take control of the narrative. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their love, but she was going to face them. And in doing so, she would confront the final piece of the puzzle that had always haunted her. The meeting was set, and as the day drew closer, Charlotte found herself preparing, not just for the confrontation, but for the realization that some wounds, though deep, could be healed in ways she hadn't yet imagined. The music that had brought her this far would help her find her way through the fog, as it always had. But this time, it was her voice that would be heard. Not the one she had once lost, but the one she had fought to find. Facing the past. The day of the meeting with her birth parents loomed on the horizon like a storm cloud, darkening the otherwise clear sky of Charlotte's life. Though she had made the decision to face them, the emotional weight of that choice settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, building a life of independence and acceptance at Street Agnes, surrounded by people who truly cared about her. But now, standing at the edge of confronting the very people who had once rejected her, Charlotte felt small again, like the frightened little girl who had been left on a doorstep in a blanket. The meeting was scheduled at Street Agnes, in the same music room where Charlotte had discovered her gift. She had insisted on this location, a place that had always been her sanctuary, a place that had shaped her into the woman she had become. The idea of sitting in a sterile conference room, or in her adoptive parents' mansion, the very setting of her abandonment, felt too foreign, too suffocating. Here, in the music room, she would be in control. Sister Mary Catherine, who had been by Charlotte's side since the day she arrived at Street Agnes, was present, as was Eleanor, her teacher and mentor. They both knew how important this moment was, not just for Charlotte, but for her healing. Eleanor had quietly been preparing Charlotte for this meeting, helping her work through the tangled web of emotions she had carried for years. But no amount of preparation could soften the rawness of what was about to take place. Charlotte was not simply going to face her birth parents. She was going to face the ghosts of her past and decide whether she was ready to forgive them. The rain began to fall in a steady drizzle as the clock ticked closer to the scheduled time. Charlotte sat at the piano, her fingers lightly brushing the keys. The sound filled the room with a soft, melancholy tone, like the soundtrack to a moment of reckoning. She had always turned to music when she was scared, when words failed her. But today, even the music couldn't ease the tension in her chest. Her heart beat loudly in her ears as she heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. The Wilsons had arrived. Margaret and James, dressed impeccably as always, stepped out of the car, their eyes scanning the imposing facade of Street Agnes. They both seemed out of place in the old, humble surroundings, their polished appearances in stark contrast to the worn edges of the orphanage. James straightened his tie nervously, and Margaret clutched her purse like a shield, her expression tight with anxiety. Charlotte's stomach twisted into a knot as she stood up from the piano. She took one last look at herself in the small mirror by the door. Her face, though still carrying the marks of her birth defects, had grown into a reflection of strength. The girl who had once been ashamed to look in the mirror had become someone unrecognizable to the person she had once been. But today, those same eyes would stare back at the parents who had turned away from her. The door opened softly, and Sister Mary Catherine entered with a warm, reassuring smile. "It's time, Charlotte," she said gently. "We're all here with you." Charlotte nodded, feeling the weight of the moment bearing down on her. She was ready, she thought. But as she walked toward the meeting room, the knot in her stomach only tightened. The closer she got, the more her heart raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking toward some sort of final judgment, one that she had no control over. When she entered the room, she saw them, Margaret and James Wilson, standing at the far side of the room. Their eyes were focused on her, and for the first time, there was no pretension, no masks to hide behind. They were just two people, older now, with their own lives filled with regret, hoping to reconnect with the child they had left behind. Margaret's eyes were full of unshed tears, but they quickly wiped them away as soon as Charlotte entered. Her gaze flickered from Charlotte's face to the ground, unable to fully meet her daughter's eyes. James stood a little straighter, his arms crossed defensively as he took in the woman Charlotte had become. For a moment, the silence between them was thick, suffocating, as if neither party knew where to begin. It was Charlotte who broke the silence, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I never wanted to meet you like this," she said, her eyes locking with Margaret's. "I never wanted to meet you at all. But here we are." Margaret flinched at Charlotte's words, and for a moment she seemed lost. But then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "Charlotte, we," she faltered, unsure of how to begin, but the words came out in a rush, as though she had been holding them in for years. "We were wrong. We were so wrong to leave you." Her voice cracked, and she took a deep, shaky breath. "I've carried this guilt for so long, and I don't know if I can ever make it right. But I need you to know, I'm sorry. We were selfish and we didn't understand. We thought we were doing what was best, but we weren't. We left you behind, and I regret it every day." Charlotte stood still, her heart heavy as Margaret's words echoed in her mind. There was no defense, no explanation that could make what had happened okay. The abandonment had been clear. It had been a decision made out of fear, out of the need to protect an image, to maintain control over a life that was designed to be perfect. There was nothing that could erase the years of hurt, the absence of a mother's love, or the trauma of being cast aside without a second thought. But as Margaret's voice faltered, Charlotte saw something in her, a vulnerability, a desperation that hadn't been there before. She was no longer the polished woman who had once turned her back on a child because of her imperfections. She was a mother who had failed, a woman who was finally acknowledging the pain she had caused. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Charlotte said, her voice quiet, but firm. "I don't know if I even want to. You left me. You gave me away like I didn't matter, like I was just a mistake you didn't want to deal with." James stepped forward then, his voice low and steady, though it trembled with emotion. "I know nothing I say will change what happened, and I don't expect forgiveness. But Charlotte, we never meant to hurt you. We didn't know how to handle it. We were terrified. And when we saw you, when we saw what you looked like, we couldn't handle it. We couldn't accept it. It was our failure, not yours. Ours." Charlotte's heart ached at the rawness in his voice. She had spent so many years angry, blaming them for her pain, but now, in this moment, she saw something else. Regret, yes, but also a genuine desire for reconciliation. She had thought that forgiveness meant erasing the past, letting it go completely, but perhaps that wasn't what it was. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting what they had done. It wasn't about erasing the hurt. It was about finding peace, about accepting that they had hurt her, but also acknowledging that they were capable of growth, of change. She didn't have to accept their apology immediately, but she could choose to see them for who they were now, not just who they had been. "I'm not ready to forgive you," Charlotte said, her voice steady, but filled with the weight of her decision. "But I'm willing to try. I can't forget, and I don't know if I ever will. But I can't keep carrying this around forever either. I don't know what this means for us, but I'll give you a chance." The silence that followed was thick, as if the world was holding its breath. Margaret and James looked at Charlotte, their eyes filled with both gratitude and sorrow, knowing that this wasn't a simple reconciliation. It was a new beginning, an uncertain, fragile step toward healing. "I'll be here," Charlotte continued, her voice softening. But only if you can accept that I'm not the same person I was. I'm not your perfect daughter. I'm not the girl you left behind. I found my place. I found my voice. And that's all I can give you." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. And I'll take whatever you give me, Charlotte. Whatever you decide, I will be here." James, too, nodded, his face a mixture of regret and hope. "We'll never make up for the years we lost. But we'll try. We'll try to be a part of your life, if you'll let us." And for the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for years. Hope. It wasn't a hope that promised an easy or perfect future, but it was the possibility of something real, something raw, something built on the truth of who they were now, not who they had been. As Charlotte stood there, facing the people who had once cast her aside, she realized that forgiveness wasn't just a gift to the other person. It was a gift she gave herself. It was the final step in her journey, the final piece of the puzzle that had been keeping her from fully embracing the woman she had become. And while it wasn't easy, it was the only way forward. The music, which had always been her refuge, now felt like a symbol of this new beginning. It was no longer just a means of escape. It was a reflection of her strength, her resilience, and her ability to heal. And perhaps most importantly, it was a reminder that no matter what had happened in the past, she had the power to shape her own future.